The morning of April 6, 1945, began deceptively calm above the waters off Okinawa. Destroyer USS Bush sat at Radar Picket Station No. 1, her crew scanning endless horizons through binoculars and radar screens. Salt spray clung to steel decks. Young sailors, some barely old enough to shave, stood at their battle stations, fingers twitching near trigger grips. Then the horizon erupted. Not with the familiar distant thunder of naval guns, but with something far worse. The sky itself seemed to tear open. 355 kamikaze aircraft, accompanied by 344 escort fighters, bore down on the American fleet like a biblical plague. Their engines screamed across the Pacific morning. Beneath those wings rode men who had kissed photographs goodbye, who had written final letters to mothers they would never see again, who believed with absolute certainty that their deaths would turn the tide of a losing war. They were wrong. What unfolded in the waters off Okinawa that day was not the divine wind Japan had prayed for. It was a collision between desperation and technology, between faith in the human spirit and faith in American industry. The Kamikazes came expecting to shatter the invasion fleet. Instead, they crashed against a steel wall they could neither penetrate nor comprehend. By early 1945, the Empire of Japan stood on the precipice. The myth of invincibility that had once propelled its armies across Southeast Asia lay shattered. American forces had island-hopped their way across the Pacific, each conquest drawing the noose tighter. Saipan had fallen. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima's black volcanic sands had drunk the blood of thousands. Now Okinawa, a mere 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, stood as the final barrier. Losing Okinawa meant losing everything. If you're finding this exploration of history compelling, consider subscribing to see more deep dives into the untold stories of World War II. These are the moments that shaped our world. This desperation birthed the kamikaze doctrine. The word itself, meaning divine wind, invoked a typhoon that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1281. Admiral Takejiro Onishi had formalized the tactic in October 1944. Standing before young pilots at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines, he told them that Japan's salvation depended on them, on their body-hitting spirit, on their willingness to become human bombs. When Onishi finished speaking, every pilot in the room volunteered. It was not madness. It was mathematics wrapped in philosophy. By 1945, Japan's skilled pilots were dead or dying. What remained were teenagers with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, barely enough to take off and land, let alone engage in aerial combat with American pilots who had 300 hours of training. A novice pilot in a dogfight with an American Hellcat had virtually no chance of survival. But a novice pilot who only needed to point his aircraft at a ship and hold the stick steady? That was achievable. The slogan of the 32nd Army defending Okinawa captured this cold logic: one plane for one warship, one boat for one ship, one man for 10 of the enemy or one tank. Between October 1944 and January 1945, approximately 650 aircraft had been expended in kamikaze sorties during the Philippines campaign. Of 364 kamikazes that appeared over Allied ships, American anti-aircraft guns claimed 231 kills, a 64% success rate for the defenders. But that still meant over 100 kamikazes had gotten through. They had damaged ships. They had killed sailors. And now, at Okinawa, Japan planned to unleash them by the hundreds. Operation Tengo would throw 10 massive waves of kamikaze attacks at the invasion fleet, each wave involving hundreds of aircraft. The first wave alone would hurl 355 suicide planes at American ships. It would be the largest single kamikaze attack of the war. If even 10% struck home, that could mean 35 ships damaged or sunk. Japan was betting everything on overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers and fanatical resolve. But they were betting against an enemy who had spent the previous year transforming naval warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his advance headquarters on Guam as reports filtered in from Okinawa. More than 1,600 ships, 350,000 naval personnel. The largest amphibious assault force ever assembled in the Pacific. All of it vulnerable to aircraft diving from the sky. The question was whether American defenses could stop them. The answer lay in 3 layers of protection, each one a technological revolution. First, the long-range defense, radar-equipped destroyers positioned in a protective arc north of Okinawa, 50 to 70 miles out from the main fleet. These radar picket ships could detect incoming aircraft up to 150 miles away, giving fleet commanders precious minutes to scramble fighters and alert gun crews. But this early warning came at a terrible price. The picket destroyers were pigeons, sitting alone in waters prowled by hundreds of kamikazes. They would be the first targets. The first to die. Second, the combat air patrol, waves of Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters orbiting above the fleet in multiple layers. By late 1945, the fast carrier force embarked more than 1,300 aircraft. Nearly 3/4 were fighters. The Hellcat, powered by a 2,000 horsepower engine, could reach 380 miles per hour. It carried 6 50-caliber machine guns that could shred a lightly armored Japanese aircraft with a 2-second burst. From its introduction through the spring of 1945, Hellcats had shot down more than 5,000 enemy aircraft. The kill ratio was 19-1. But even Hellcats could be overwhelmed. Which brought the defense to its third and most revolutionary layer, the proximity fuse. Before 1943, shooting down an aircraft with anti-aircraft fire was an exercise in frustration. The timed fuse required perfect prediction of where the enemy aircraft would be several seconds in the future. Against a maneuvering target, timed fuses were little better than throwing rocks. The contact fuse only detonated on direct impact, which was nearly impossible against fast-moving targets miles away. The statistics told the story. Conventional 5-inch guns using timed fuses required an average of 1,162 rounds to shoot down a single kamikaze. Over 1,000 shells to destroy one aircraft. The proximity fuse changed everything. Developed by Section T of the National Defense Research Committee, it packed a miniature radar transceiver inside a 5-inch shell. This tiny radar would transmit radio waves as the shell flew through the air. When those waves bounced back from a nearby aircraft, the fuse would detonate automatically. The shell didn't need to hit the aircraft. It only needed to pass within 70 feet. At that range, the explosion would send a lethal cloud of shrapnel in all directions. The engineering challenges had been immense. The fuse had to survive being fired from a gun, which subjected it to forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. By 1945, they had solved these problems. The cost per fuse had dropped from $732 to just $18. Production had ramped to such a degree that over 22 million fuses would be manufactured during the war. The results were staggering. A 5-inch gun equipped with VT fuses required an average of just 310 rounds to shoot down a kamikaze. This was nearly 4 times more effective than traditional fuses. Vannevar Bush, head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, estimated the proximity fuse increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery by 700%. But the fuse had one critical limitation: time. Heavy guns needed distance to be effective. At ranges beyond 5,000 yards, the system was devastating. But kamikazes attacking radar picket destroyers didn't approach from 5,000 yards. They came in low and fast, sometimes emerging from clouds at point-blank range. The burden of point defense fell to smaller weapons. The 40mm Bofors gun and the 20mm Oerlikon cannon became the last line of defense. During the Okinawa campaign, 40mm guns were credited with nearly 47% of kamikazes shot down by shipboard fire. 20mm guns accounted for another 32%. The 5-inch guns, despite their technological sophistication, claimed just under 16%. Because by the time most kamikazes got close enough for the 5-inch guns to engage them, they were already too close. This was the deadly arithmetic of kamikaze defense. The best technology in the world still required the one thing no machine could guarantee: time. By April 6th, every piece of this defensive system was in place. What the Americans didn't know was just how large the attack would be. At bases across Kyushu, pilots climbed into cockpits for the last time. Most had less than 100 hours of flight time. They wore white headbands emblazoned with the rising sun. All of them believed their sacrifice would matter. That one plane could destroy one warship. that the divine wind would blow once more. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the first wave lifted off. 355 kamikaze aircraft. The largest single kamikaze attack of the entire war. They turned south toward Okinawa. Toward the American fleet. Toward the radar picket line that was about to become a slaughterhouse. Commander Ralph Westholme stood on the bridge of USS Bush. The SK air search radar picked up the first contacts at approximately 50 miles out. The scope lit up like a constellation. Dozens of contacts. Then more still. The radar operator's voice crackled, multiple bogies inbound. Bearing 340. Range 45 miles and closing. Estimate at least 40 to 60 aircraft. Maybe more. Westholme grabbed the radio. Commence firing when targets are in range. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. The kamikazes spread out as they approached, breaking into smaller groups to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. It was the tactic Japan had developed over months. Don't approach in a single mass. Spread out. Attack from different altitudes. Use the sun. Make the defenders divide their fire. Overwhelm them with targets. The first kamikazes reached Bush shortly after noon. 4 Hellcats from the Combat Air Patrol screamed down from altitude, their machine guns hammering the sky. The lead kamikaze took hits across its wing and fuselage. But the pilot held course. The destroyer's 40mm guns opened up. The Zero flew directly into the stream of fire, shredding under the impacts. At the last second, the aircraft disintegrated, its bomb detonating close enough to spray Bush's deck with shrapnel but causing no serious damage. One down. But there were dozens more behind it. Over the next 90 minutes, kamikazes attacked Bush in waves. The crew shot down aircraft after aircraft. But for every kamikaze destroyed, 2 more appeared. At approximately 1300 hours, a Naval dive bomber broke through. Its pilot, wounded and bleeding, held his stick steady. The Naval struck Bush's No. 2 gun mount and exploded. The blast ripped through the destroyer's midsection. Fire erupted. 11 men died instantly. Then the second kamikaze hit. This one struck Bush's forward engine room. The explosion tore a massive hole in the ship's side. Seawater poured in. Bush began to list to starboard. Commander Westholme gave the order to abandon ship. Within minutes, sailors were leaping into the oil-slicked water. Some were pulled under by the suction as Bush went down. Nearby, USS Coalhound suffered the same fate. 6 kamikazes attacked her in rapid succession. She shot down 4. The other 2 struck home. Within an hour, she too was sinking. The first wave of Kikusu No. 1 lasted 5 hours. When it finally ended, the Americans counted the cost. 3 destroyers sunk outright. LST-347 sunk. 2 ammunition ships destroyed. 10 other ships damaged. 355 kamikazes had attacked. None returned home. All were either shot down or crashed into ships or ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. For Japan, the loss rate was 100%. But they had sunk ships. They had killed sailors. And there were 9 more waves to come. The answer came 10 days later. On April 16th, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton stood on the bridge of USS Laffey as his destroyer took up position at Radar Picket Station No. 1. Beckton pressed the intercom. "This is the captain speaking. I expect to see plenty of Japanese. But I have confidence in this crew's ability. We've tangled with them before and won. We're going to make the Japanese wish they had never heard of USS Laffey." At 8:25 in the morning, radar screens lit up. Dozens of contacts inbound. Then the kamikazes appeared. Over the next 80 minutes, 22 kamikaze aircraft attacked Laffey. The first 8 never reached the ship. Laffey's gunners shot them down one after another. Zeros disintegrated. Vals tumbled into the sea trailing smoke. But the 9th kamikaze broke through. An Val, its pilot already wounded, crashed just off the starboard quarter. Aviation fuel sprayed across the after section. 30 seconds later, the second kamikaze struck. A Yokosuka Judy smashed into gun mounts on the starboard side. 3 gunners died outright. Burning gasoline flooded across the deck. Ammunition began cooking off in the heat. Then came the third hit. Another valve struck gun mount 53 directly. 6 men inside died instantly. A fourth valve dropped a bomb that tore through the hull and exploded inside the ship. A fifth kamikaze jammed the rudder. Laffy began steaming in a tight circle, unable to steer, her after-section burning, her defensive firepower cut nearly in half. Yet her crew kept fighting. With the ship locked in a hard turn, gunners tracked targets manually. Damage control teams battled fires while under attack. A sixth kamikaze struck amidships. Then a seventh. By the time the attack ended, Laffy had been hit by 4 bombs and 6 kamikaze aircraft. 32 sailors were dead. 71 were wounded. Communications Officer Lieutenant Frank Manson asked, "Captain, we're in pretty bad shape aft. Do you think we'll have to abandon ship?" Beckton's answer was instant, "Hell no. We still have guns that can shoot. I'll never abandon ship as long as a single gun will fire." They didn't abandon ship. Laffy survived. She became known as the ship that would not die. And she was not alone. Across the radar picket line, other destroyers fought the same desperate battles. USS Kassin Young endured 85 kamikaze attacks on April 6 alone, staying at battle stations for 19 hours straight. The kamikazes kept coming. Kikusu No. 2 on April 12. No. 3 on April 16. No. 4 on April 27. Each wave involving hundreds of aircraft. Each wave met by combat air patrol fighters, by proximity-fused shells, by desperate gun crews. The defensive system was working. But it was not perfect. On May 11, 1945, 2 kamikazes slipped through the defenses around Task Force 58. They had followed returning American aircraft through the clouds, hiding in radar clutter. Their target was the flagship, USS Bunker Hill. At 10:05 in the morning, Lieutenant Junior Grade Seizo Yosunori emerged from low clouds and dove toward Bunker Hill. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. But he held course. Yosunori dropped his 550-pound bomb. Then his Zero crashed onto the flight deck among parked aircraft. Aviation fuel ignited instantly. Bombs and ammunition began cooking off. 30 seconds later, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa dove through the anti-aircraft fire. He dropped his bomb near the island superstructure, then crashed directly into it. The bomb exploded in the ready rooms below, killing dozens of airmen instantly. Within minutes, Bunker Hill was an inferno. Flames rolled across the flight deck. Explosions rocked the ship. Men trapped below burned alive or suffocated. Others leaped into the sea. Light cruiser USS Wilkes-Barre closed alongside and turned her fire hoses on the carrier. Destroyer USS Kassin Young picked up survivors from the water. By evening, the fires were controlled. But the cost was staggering. 396 men killed or missing. 264 wounded. It was the second highest casualty count of any American carrier that survived the war. Bunker Hill limped away from Okinawa. She never returned to combat. The kamikaze attack had been devastating. But it had not been decisive. The fleet continued operations. Other carriers filled the gap. The invasion of Okinawa pressed forward. And the kamikazes kept dying by the hundreds. Between April 6 and June 22, 1945, Japan launched 10 mass kamikaze attacks. More than 1,465 kamikaze aircraft were expended at Okinawa. The statistics told a brutal story. Of those 1,465 kamikazes, only 133 scored direct hits on ships. That meant roughly 83% failed to strike their targets. They were shot down by fighters, destroyed by proximity-fused fire, shredded by close-in guns, or they simply missed. The ships they did hit were mostly destroyers and smaller vessels. 36 American ships sank during the campaign. But no aircraft carriers went down. No battleships. No cruisers. The capital ships that truly mattered survived. For Japan, the cost was catastrophic. Over 3,000 pilots dead. Men who could never be replaced. Aircraft that would never defend the home islands. And what had they achieved? They had delayed the fleet. They had killed nearly 5,000 sailors. But they had not stopped the invasion. They had not broken American will. They had not forced the United States to negotiate. The Kamikaze doctrine, born of desperation, had failed. Why? The answer lay not in courage. Japanese pilots had proven their willingness to die. But conviction was not enough against an enemy who had transformed naval warfare through innovation and industrial power. The VT proximity fuse alone had revolutionized anti-aircraft defense. The effectiveness improvement was 700%. The combat air patrol added another layer. Hellcats with their 19-to-1 kill ratio prowled the skies. The radar picket destroyers gave fleet commanders precious minutes of warning. And behind it all stood American industry. The proximity fuses that cost $732 each in 1942 now cost $18. Ships damaged by kamikazes were repaired and returned to service. Aircraft shot down were replaced. Pilots killed were replaced by fresh graduates from training programs that produced hundreds of aviators every month. Japan could not match this. Japanese industry was collapsing under American bombing. Fuel shortages limited pilot training to the point where some kamikaze pilots had less than 50 hours of flight time. By late spring 1945, many pilots were resentful conscripts who flew to their deaths drunk and bitter. This was not the divine wind. This was the death rattle of an empire. If this story of innovation versus desperation resonates with you, I encourage you to explore more untold chapters of the Pacific War. Understanding how technology shaped these desperate final battles helps us grasp the true cost of total war. Yet even in failure, the kamikazes left scars. For American sailors who survived kamikaze attacks, the psychological toll was immense. Imagine standing on deck, watching aircraft dive directly at you. Watching your guns fire. Watching a Zero disintegrate but continue its dive anyway. The dead pilot's hands still on the stick. The impact. The explosion. The fire. Your shipmates burning. The knowledge that tomorrow you would face it all again. Sailors aboard damaged ships told Laffey's crew what to expect. A gun captain from USS Purdy offered this assessment. You guys have a fighting chance, but they'll keep on coming till they get you. In the end, there'll be this one bastard with your name on his ticket. The casualty figures were staggering. Nearly 5,000 Navy officers and seamen killed. Another 5,000 wounded or missing. For many American military leaders, these casualties reinforced the conviction that invading Japan itself would be catastrophic. This question haunted the Joint Chiefs as they planned Operation Downfall. Estimates suggested American casualties could exceed 500,000. The memory of Okinawa's kamikaze campaign factored into the decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In this sense, the kamikazes achieved something. Not victory. But they inflicted enough casualties, created enough fear, demonstrated enough fanaticism that American leaders chose nuclear weapons over conventional invasion. The kamikaze pilots who died at Okinawa never knew this. They died believing their sacrifice had failed. But their deaths shaped the final chapter of the war in ways they could never have imagined. For Japan, the lessons came too late. The kamikaze doctrine had promised that spirit could overcome material. That one plane could sink one ship. But the mathematics of war proved otherwise. American technology, industry, and training had created a defensive system that kamikazes could not penetrate in sufficient numbers to matter. The proximity fuse. The combat air patrol. The radar picket line. These innovations did not make ships invulnerable. Laffey, Bunker Hill, and dozens of other vessels proved that kamikazes could still strike home. But the innovations made kamikaze attacks inefficient. They shifted the calculus from one plane, one ship to 10 planes, one ship, or 20 planes, one ship. And Japan did not have enough aircraft or pilots to sustain those losses. By June 22, when the final attack ended, the kamikaze campaign had expended over 1,800 aircraft. Over 3,000 pilots dead. And Okinawa still fell. The island became an American base. The invasion fleet sat untouched just 350 miles from the home islands. The divine wind had blown. But it had not saved Japan. In the years after the war, historians studied the campaign extensively. Some argued that kamikazes were more effective than conventional attacks. This was true, but it ignored the larger strategic failure. Japan needed to destroy carriers, sink battleships, cripple the invasion fleet. Instead, kamikazes sank mostly destroyers. Ships that were tragic losses but strategically replaceable. The fundamental lesson was simpler. Desperation is not strategy. Japan's kamikaze doctrine emerged from weakness. With skilled pilots dead, with fuel scarce, with conventional tactics failing, kamikazes seemed like the only option. But this equation ignored one critical variable. It assumed American defenses would remain static. America adapted. The proximity fuse was mass-produced. Combat air patrol tactics were refined. Radar picket destroyers accepted terrible casualties to give the fleet warning. Close-in weapons were upgraded. This was the steel wall Japan crashed against. Not invincible. Not without cost. But strong enough, adaptive enough, and backed by sufficient industrial power that kamikazes could not break through in decisive numbers. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The kamikaze campaign officially ended. Ships like Laffy became museums. The proximity fuse influenced weapons development for decades. The lessons shaped naval doctrine for the Cold War. For the sailors who survived, memories lingered. Some carried them with pride. Others as burdens. Red Landman, an aviation mechanic aboard Bunker Hill, was 100 years old when he finally spoke publicly about May 11th. He remembered the flames, the explosions, the struggle to save wounded shipmates. When asked about a book written about Bunker Hill's ordeal, he said he couldn't listen to the ending. Too emotional. Too many ghosts. Commander Beckton wrote a book titled The Ship That Would Not Die. In it, he described the 80 minutes his crew endured. 6 kamikaze hits. 4 bombs. And his response when asked about abandoning ship, hell no. We still have guns that can shoot. These stories matter because they reveal what the statistics cannot. Behind every number was a person. Behind every ship lost was a crew. Behind every kamikaze shot down was a young pilot who believed his death would save his country. The day 500 kamikazes failed to stop America's steel wall was not one day. It was 3 months of continuous combat. 10 mass attacks. Hundreds of smaller raids. Over 1,400 kamikaze aircraft expended. 3,000 pilots dead. And what they crashed against was not just guns and radar and proximity fuses. It was the industrial might of a nation that could build ships faster than Japan could sink them. That could train pilots faster than they could be killed. That could innovate and adapt faster than its enemy could exploit new tactics. The kamikazes were brave. They were committed. They believed with absolute conviction that their sacrifice mattered. But conviction without the means to achieve victory is simply tragedy. Japan was stunned not by a single day, but by the accumulation of failures across 3 months. By the realization that even their most fanatical weapon could not stop the American advance. By the mathematics of attrition that showed spirit alone could not overcome technology and industry. This was more than a military campaign. It was a collision between 2 fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. Japan bet on the human spirit, on sacrifice, on the willingness of young men to die for their emperor and homeland. America bet on innovation, on mass production, on the ability to translate industrial capacity into military supremacy. One approach relied on irreplaceable human lives. The other relied on replaceable machines and continuously improving technology. The steel wall held. The ships sailed on. And the empire that had gambled everything on the divine wind discovered that in modern warfare, there are no miracles. Only the cold equations of production, innovation, and industrial power. The kamikazes had crashed against that reality. And they had lost.